Week 9 of the fantasy football season is here, and from a quarterback perspective, that is not a good thing. As we head into this week, we have 4 of our top 14 quarterbacks in fantasy on bye. We just lost Kirk Cousins. Matthew Stafford is hurt. Kenny Pickett is hurt. Desmond Ridder basically just got benched. 2 of our best quarterbacks in fantasy, Tua and Mahomes, they had to fly internationally to Germany, and we know all those international games are just offensive explosions. And then, oh yeah, just to top it all off, a top 12 fantasy quarterback just got benched and lost his job. What is going on, Headliner Nation? Hopefully everyone's doing well out there. Happy Halloween to you out there. Hopefully we get more treats this week than all the tricks that we got last week, right? We saw the likes of Will Levis, Josh Dobbs, Tyson Bagent. They went out there and outscored Patrick Mahomes, Lamar Jackson, and CJ Stroud, and that was a huge kick to the fantasy candy sack, if you know what I mean. It's Halloween though, so you better believe I'm feeling a little bit generous. So not only do I have a giveaway for this video, but I need to announce a winner from last week's giveaway. Remember we had a full-size signed Keenan Allen helmet? Why not announce the winner right now? And we had a lot of people interested in that Keenan Allen helmet, but congratulations to Mona Slavins 4584. Congratulations. Go ahead and send me an email to info@thefantasyheadliners.com from that account right there, and we will get you hooked up with your full-size Keenan Allen helmet. But what about a new item for this week, right? I can't hand out candy through the screen, but I can hand out something else, and this is something we haven't done for quite a while, because I know we do a lot of footballs and jerseys and helmets, but how about a signed autographed rookie card of Jamar Chase? Right there, you can see the auto right there on the card. This right here is a sick card, only 75 of them. This is number 59 of 75, still sealed right here by Panini themselves. And I guarantee a lot of people are going to be interested in this, but how do you get in on this giveaway? It's super simple. All you have to do is like the video, leave a comment down below letting me know that you're interested, and then be sure to have a free account signed up at pristineauction.com. It doesn't cost you anything to do this. Just be sure to use referral code HEADLINERS when you do so. By doing that, we're going to put a coupon into your account, so as you're scrolling through their site at some point in the future, I know you're gonna find something you love. Everything in my office is from Pristine Auction. It doesn't matter if you're into TV, movies, video games, whatever it may be, they have you covered. There's something for everyone on pristineauction.com. Why not get a little bit of a discount if you can find yourself winning one of those auctions? I love the 10-minute auctions. They're always up on my desktop during the week. You can get some great deals. I got an autographed jersey a couple weeks ago for like 40-45 bucks. Great deals there on their 10-minute auctions. But all right, I'm feeling a little bit better now. We were able to give something away, giving back to the community on Halloween. I feel like I handed out my candy for the day, so now we can talk some football. Got to try to suck it up and see if we can find some options here for week 9. We're kicking it off on Thursday night with the Titans and Steelers. And what a debut it was for Will Levis in his first ever NFL start. 238 yards, 4 tutties, and no interceptions. 3 of those touchdowns going to DeAndre Hopkins. And we saw that big arm on full display. Now, that shouldn't have surprised anybody, right? We knew he had a big arm coming into the league, but is this something we can count on going forward? Probably not. I mean, even head coach Mike Vrabel himself has come out here recently and said, as of right now, it's Will Levis, but we'll look at things here in the future. He's not even committed to Levis rest of season. Let's not forget, this guy did slip in the NFL draft, and he was actually inactive for the first 6 weeks of this season, but no doubt he opens up this passing game a lot better than Ryan Tannehill, which is also going to be great for all the Derrick Henry owners out there, because maybe now he'll have a few more lanes to run through. Defenses now will have to account for the ball to be deeper down the field in the passing game, and that's something we really haven't had to worry about much in Tennessee here for what feels like years, really. But can we really rely on 4 touchdowns a week from Will Levis? No, I don't expect that to happen a whole lot of times here in the near future. Now a matchup this week going up against Pittsburgh on the road in Pittsburgh. They allow right around 16.2 fantasy points per game. In a short week, though, I expect a lot of names to be on the injury report, but don't freak out. It's just a little bit of added rest to start the week. That's pretty normal for Thursday night football games. All the big-time weapons should be there. But there is no way me, or anyone for that matter, should be able to sit here and look at a camera and say that Will Levis is a safe fantasy football start here in week 9, because he is absolutely not a safe fantasy football start. This isn't some cream puff matchup. It's going to be primetime football in a short week, and honestly, my biggest concern is that he doesn't have enough weapons to give him that ceiling game each and every week. I think we can all agree that DeAndre Hopkins, even though he's not washed, isn't somebody who's going to get 3 touchdowns every single game for remainder of the season. However, Will Levis's floor, it's not horrible this week. He's not going to be a top 12 option for me, but for those of you who play in 2 quarterback leagues, he definitely could be somebody with a little bit of appeal, but you got to know there's still a lot of risk involved with it. As for his opponent, looks like it's going to be Kenny Pickett. Now, he was banged up last week. A lot of questions surrounding whether or not he was going to even play this week. Well, he himself came out in an interview earlier today and said, yeah, absolutely, I'm playing in week 9, which is good because at least we know what to expect, because we know we weren't going to start Mitchie Biscuits, Mitchell Trubisky in fantasy football. But what about Kenny Pickett? He is going to be a huge risk, because we have to be honest with ourselves. It's not like this is some quarterback who's going out there each and every week and scoring 20 plus fantasy points. He's already struggled to produce, and now he has a rib injury that we have to worry about. Not only that, the defensive line of the Tennessee Titans has a tendency to get after the quarterback, and all it could take is one hit to already injured ribs, and we could lose Kenny Pickett halfway through the game again. Now, Tennessee right now allows 15.5 fantasy points per contest to opposing quarterbacks, and we've seen quarterbacks try to play through rib injuries before. Do you remember last year with Justin Herbert? He struggled, right? They definitely take a hit in production, which is not what we need from Kenny Pickett, because his production is already super low. We can't afford for it to go any lower in our fantasy football lineups. At this point of the season, I know there's not a whole lot of great options out there, but me, personally, heading into a fantasy football matchup, I would much rather take my chances on a quarterback with some risk that at least is healthy coming into the ball game. The last thing I want to do as a fantasy manager is start a player who I know is injured going into that game and then end up losing them at some point throughout that game due to the injury they came in with. That right there has to be one of the worst things in fantasy football to have happen to your team. So just know, if you got to roll Kenny Pickett, a lot of risk. All right, now we're going to head in to some Sunday football, but you don't get to sleep in. We have another game, an international game at 9:30 a.m. Eastern time. And this one is between 2 of the best quarterbacks in fantasy football in the Miami Dolphins and Kansas City Chiefs, with Tua Tagovailoa and Patrick Mahomes. But we'll go ahead and start off with Miami. And honestly, I still don't love international games. From my fantasy perspective, that is, because more times than not, the overall NFL offenses just struggle to put up points compared to what they usually do in normal settings. But as of right now, Tua is the quarterback 5 overall in fantasy football, averaging 20 fantasy points per game. And I actually heard through the grapevine that there were some experts last week that were telling people to sit Tua. That right there is just the definition of trying to be a little bit too cute, or you're desperate for clicks. Because this may not be the best matchup for Tua this week going up against Kansas City, because they allow only 14.2 fantasy points per game, which tells me that this isn't going to be the best matchup for Tua. It's going to lower his ceiling a little bit. But let me keep this super simple stupid for you. If Tua, Tyreek, and Waddle are all healthy, they're all in your lineup each and every week. This offense, as an overall, has a ceiling that's way too high that you cannot afford to sit any of these guys week in and week out. They have the ability themselves of winning you a matchup. There are very few players that you can really say that about week in and week out in fantasy football. Don't get too cute. If you have them on your roster, you have them in your lineup. For their opponents, it's Patrick Mahomes. You know you got to start Patrick Mahomes as well, even though last week we kind of found what his ultimate kryptonite is, right? It's the 2023 Denver Broncos. In 2 games against Denver, Patrick Mahomes has 1 touchdown and 4 turnovers against Denver. But really, overall, Mahomes hasn't been what he has been in the past here as of late. Only 1 time over his last 5 weeks has he gone over 20 fantasy points. And on top of that, he's on pace for a career high in interceptions. Like I said, it's just not really what we're used to seeing week in and week out from Patrick Mahomes. Now a matchup going up against Miami. They allow over 18.5 fantasy points per game, but honestly, that number should be maybe a little bit higher, because some of their recent matchups are against New England, Carolina, the New York Giants, not really high-powered passing offenses, so definitely an opportunity for Patrick Mahomes to score some big points. Plus, no other new injuries in Kansas City, but we know we never ever sit Patrick Mahomes. Let's just hope that both of these teams can forget about all the travel, all the change in routine, and just have themselves a nice high-scoring back-and-forth shootout. Which will then bring us to the afternoon games, right? We're all awake now. We got the Minnesota Vikings and Atlanta Falcons, and we all wish we were still sleeping, right? Because in this matchup, it's a couple of guys that we're probably not going to start in fantasy football here this week. Sounds like it's going to be rookie fifth-rounder Jaren Hall for the Minnesota Vikings. They did just complete a trade for Joshua Dobbs from the Arizona Cardinals, but as of right now, they're prepping Jaren Hall to be the starter here this week. I absolutely hate that we've lost Kirk Cousins in this offense. He definitely brings that overall ceiling to a whole nother level. Because let's be completely honest, whether it's Jaren Hall or it's Joshua Dobbs, the ceiling for these wide receivers and these overall offensive players is not going to be what it was with Kirk Cousins. As for this week, though, they have a matchup going up against Atlanta, who's been a super solid defense majority of the season, but they were just destroyed last week by Will Levis and the Tennessee Titans. On the year, the Falcons are allowing 17.5 fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks, but we're not going to start rookie fifth-rounder Jaren Hall in his first ever NFL game. So many people out there probably never even heard of Jaren Hall. Now, if he goes out there and has a good game, maybe he starts the next few games. If he struggles, don't be surprised if we see Josh Dobbs starting there next week. Now, as for their opponents, you got the Atlanta Falcons, you got Desmond Ridder, you got Taylor Heineke. We don't even know which one of these guys is going to start yet for sure, but doesn't really matter. Because without the clear switch from Ridder to Heineke, that just opens the door for Arthur Smith and that stupid-looking mustache to make some type of mid-game switch that would absolutely kill us from a fantasy perspective. Really, all that guy does each and every week is make questionable calls as is. Then we add this on top of what we've already had the last few weeks with like Bijan Robinson. No, thank you. Now, from an overall perspective, offensive-wise here in Atlanta, Taylor Heineke, I believe, is the better overall option, especially since Desmond Ridder has turned into a turnover machine. 7 turnovers over the last 3 games played. Now a matchup going up against Minnesota. They allow 17.6 fantasy points per game, 11th most in the league, but this defense has definitely been playing better as of late, and they've forced 7 turnovers themselves now over the last 3 weeks of the season. Let's also not forget that Drake London suffered a groin injury back in week 8. We're not even for sure that he's going to be able to play this week or not. Now, this offense in Atlanta already doesn't score that many points. They're 28th in the NFL in scoring. Now they have a quarterback controversy, and their number 1 wide receiver is dealing with a groin injury. I don't know about you, but this just screams huge risk all around. Which will now take us out to Baltimore for the Ravens and the Seahawks. We'll start off with Geno Smith because for the first time in 2023, Geno has now had back-to-back games with multiple touchdowns. But thanks to all the turnovers, he still hasn't scored over 15 fantasy points in a game since week 3. In his last 4 games, he has 6 total turnovers. He's also had the luxury of playing at home the last 2 weeks. Now he has to go on the road to face Baltimore and one of the best defenses overall in the NFL. They allow only 12.3 fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks. That is lowest in the league. Now overall, Seattle starting to get a little bit healthier, but given the situation here in week 9, you kind of have to look at Geno as an option for your fantasy team, but you got to know it's still a risky option. The only reason that I still don't hate Geno, he's got plenty of weapons. DK Metcalf, Tyler Lockett, JSN, Jake motherfucking Bobo out there. You have to think that they give Geno Smith a chance to find the end zone multiple times each and every week, and that's why I don't mind him in week 9. He's not somebody who I feel super comfortable about just because we haven't seen prolonged good play out of Geno for quite some time. He won't be somebody who's highly ranked, but definitely an option here in week 9. His opponent, Lamar Jackson. You know you're going to start Lamar Jackson each and every week. Unfortunately, last week, Lamar didn't really do a whole lot of anything. They didn't really need him to. Arizona couldn't stop the run, and Gus Edwards ran all over them. They didn't really have to throw the ball very much. Lamar himself, though, he's not playing bad football at all. He's starting to make some of those crazy Patrick Mahomes-esque type throws in games as well. It's making a lot of people really understand that Lamar Jackson isn't just a running back. He's turned into a great quarterback as well. What they really need in Baltimore is to face a tough run defense, right? Really force Lamar to have to throw. Well, perfect opportunity here because Seattle is ranked 8th in the NFL when it comes to rushing defense. Now, they do allow 16.7 fantasy points per contest to opposing quarterbacks. No new injuries in Baltimore, and there is no way, like I said, we ever remotely think about sitting Lamar Jackson, but let's really hope that Seattle can limit the running game here so we can see Lamar Jackson airing it out down the field and racking up fantasy points. All right, next game, Arizona Cardinals, Cleveland Browns. Woof, right? We're going to have another rookie 5th rounder, Clayton Tune. So Josh Dobbs dealt to Minnesota. They said if Kyler wasn't ready to go, they're going to go with Clayton Tune, and that's where it's looking like it's heading. But I'm sorry, I'm not starting a rookie 5th round quarterback on a below average offense on the road in Cleveland against the #1 passing defense in the NFL, and they only allow 14 fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks, 6th fewest in the league. Clayton Tune will not be an option for me here this week. But really a lot of the same can be said for Cleveland, right? And PJ Walker. Nobody out there wants to start PJ Walker, even though he's coming off his best game of the season. In week 8, he scored twice as many points as he did in any other game this season so far. The problem with that is he only scored 12 fantasy points. Now, don't get me wrong, this isn't a bad matchup going up against Arizona. They allow 18.6 fantasy points per game, but Arizona can't stop the run, and Cleveland likes to run the football a lot. I expect a whole lot of running in this game, not a whole lot of PJ Walker, and way too much risk for me to worry about it in my fantasy football lineup. So let's go on to the next matchup here, the Los Angeles Rams and Green Bay Packers. And right off the bat, we got Matthew Stafford dealing with an injury. He has a UCL sprain to his right thumb, is currently day-to-day, and has a real chance of not playing in this ball game. Even at 100% healthy, he really hasn't been able to put up big numbers. Only one game all season long with multiple touchdowns. He hasn't thrown for over 300 yards in a game since week 4, and now has to deal with an injury to the thumb on his throwing hand against a solid passing defense in Green Bay. They allow only 15.2 fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks, and they are way easier to run on than they are to throw on. Plus, last week, Puka suffered a minor knee injury, has him questionable here in week 9. Now, we know there is no way that we're starting the backup quarterback for the Los Angeles Rams in fantasy football, but if we do end up having Matthew Stafford, this is really similar to the risk that I spoke of at the beginning of the show with Kenny Pickett. We run the risk of him taking just one hit, not being able to hold on to the football, maybe a few turnovers early where they decide to pull him out of the game so they prevent worse injuries from happening. This is just another one of those situations where if you decide to throw him into your fantasy lineup and he plays, it is going to be a huge risk. Honestly, I would prefer they sit him so that we don't lose him for a prolonged period of time. But what about his opponent, right? Jordan Love of the Green Bay Packers. And I get it. Jordan Love isn't out there lighting up the scoreboard, and overall, this Packers offense looks just horrible, but it's not due to bad quarterback play all the time. And fantasy-wise, Jordan Love really hasn't been that bad. He's had at least 15 fantasy points in 6 of the 7 games he's played this season. For those of you saying, but yeah, bro, 15 points a game, that sucks. Well, tell that to the Patrick Mahomes owners last week who only had 7 fantasy points. I'm pretty sure they would love to have those 8 extra points. But now he gets a matchup going up against the Rams. They allow 18.3 fantasy points per contest to opposing quarterbacks, and Dak and the Cowboys just had their way against this defense. No new injuries in Green Bay. Overall, though, this offense is basically hot garbage. It was masked for years by the quarterback play of Aaron Rodgers and the pass-catching ability of Devontae Adams, and now we can really see it for what it truly is, a jumbled mess. Love may not be pretty, but we have to admit that his floor, from what we've seen so far here this year, is pretty freaking safe week in and week out. Do I look at this as some smash start for Jordan Love? No, but he is an option for us here in week 9. How about Tampa Bay and Houston? Now let's start off with the Bake Show, Baker Mayfield, coming off a game in which he didn't really look good for majority of the game. However, he did find the end zone in garbage time and ended up with a overall solid day when it comes to fantasy football. Only his 3rd game all year here with multiple touchdowns, but they have been starting to throw the ball a lot more here as of late, and that's what I really want to focus on. Baker Mayfield didn't have any games with over 40 pass attempts the first 6 weeks of the season. He has now thrown the ball over 40 times in back-to-back games, and that's because the running game and the inefficiencies of Rachaad White just isn't leading to anything productive. They're having to throw the ball. Now they're going up against Houston, a solid defense. They allow 16.5 fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks, which is right around where Baker averages. No new injuries in Tampa Bay, but Houston has allowed over 340 yards passing in 2 of their last 3 ball games, and they've played against the run pretty freaking good here as of late. I won't be surprised once again if we see Baker Mayfield airing it out over 40 times this week, and really could be a fantasy option for us as well. His opponent, CJ Stroud. And he's really seemed to cool off here over the last couple of weeks, but we got to remember a couple things. One, he didn't have Tank Dell for all those games, and he has missed out on a couple huge plays by inches to his pass catchers that would really make his numbers look way better and more consistent with what they look like to start the season. You have to think that some of those start to connect and he bounces back. Nico Collins continues to be a matchup nightmare. He missed like a 70-yard touchdown this past week because he was tripped by a defender. Had that not happened, we're talking about Nico Collins as a top 12 wide receiver, CJ Stroud right back up there in the upper echelon of fantasy quarterbacks. Now, we would love to get to a spot where Tank Dell is a little bit more consistent in this offense. As of right now, seems a little bit more boom or bust, but is getting some of those deeper shots down the field each week. So you got to think some of these big plays are coming. Now they're going up against Tampa Bay. They allow 17.8 fantasy points per game. They are way easier to throw on than run on, which is good because this offensive line is still in shambles in Houston, and the running game is basically non-existent. It's one of the worst in the league. But this isn't one of the old Houston Texans teams of old that we're contemplating whether or not they're tanking. They're trying to win ball games in Houston. CJ Stroud now hasn't had over 27 pass attempts in a game over the last 2 weeks. If they want to win this ball game, they're going to have to throw the ball a lot, and that's why I don't hate CJ Stroud in week 9. How about the Washington Commandos and New England Patriots? We'll start off with Sam Howell. And honestly, he kind of continues to be one of the better calls I've had so far this year. I've loved Sam Howell since he was drafted. I mean, this guy's defense is so bad, he basically has to go out each and every week and throw until his arm falls off. He's had over 40 pass attempts now in 4 of his last 5 games played, and last week was the overall quarterback 1 in fantasy football. He's thrown for multiple touchdowns in 3 of his last 4 games played, and by the grace of the fantasy gods, he's finally starting to use Jahan Dotson. There is no coincidence that when Jahan Dotson had his best game of the season, Sam Howell had his as well. That's what really gives Sam Howell that super high ceiling, is that additional weapon in Jahan Dotson, and they need to continue to use him. Now in a matchup going up against New England, they allow 15.5 fantasy points per game. Curtis Samuel, currently banged up, he's questionable to play, but if they can really utilize Jahan Dotson, he really won't be missed. Overall, Sam Howell is the quarterback 8 on the season. He scored at least 16 fantasy points in 6 of his 8 games played this year. He scored over 20 fantasy points in 3 of those ball games, and we would love a better matchup than New England here this week. But with the way that this week is going, at least we know what to expect from Sam Howell, and he's somebody that I would put in my fantasy lineup. His opponent, Mac Jones. Mac Jones has more touchdowns over the last 2 weeks of the season than he did in the previous 5 games played. Now, that doesn't really mean big fantasy points. He's averaging 16 fantasy points per contest over those last 2 ball games, but that is way better than what he was doing to start the season. There's a problem, though. He just lost his overall number 1 wide receiver, Kendrick Bourne, who tore his ACL in week 8. So does he really even have enough weapons to put up fantasy numbers? On paper, I would say, heck no. Even right now, Devontae Parker currently in the concussion protocol. If he doesn't have him as well, we're just running out of weapons in New England. Now a matchup going up against Washington, and this defense just plain blows. They allow over 21.9 fantasy points per game, second most in the NFL. Now, aside from the Bourne injury and the Parker injury, this offensive line still super banged up as well. This is one of those, but the matchup is good type scenarios. No part of me wants to start Mac Jones. He's not going to be in my top 12. If you need a quarterback 2 in your league, though, cross your fingers because the matchup is that good. Which will then take us down to New Orleans and Chicago for the Bears and the Saints, and we'll start off with Tyson Bagent. Now, you all know I love myself some Tyson Bagent. I actually had him inside my top 24 rankings just last week. He finished as quarterback 22, so overall it basically kind of worked out as a low-end quarterback 2 option. Now the ceiling though, it's still going to be pretty low, and we kind of know that, right around 13 or 14 points a week. Not great, right? But not horrible either. But now he has a matchup on the road against the Saints, who allow only 14.8 fantasy points per game, 7th fewest in the league. No new injuries in Chicago, but Tyson Bagent, once again, not going to be anything but a low-end quarterback 2 for me here this week. His opponent, Derek Carr, don't look now, but Derek Carr is starting to hit his stride. 3 straight games over 17 fantasy points per game. 3 straight games over 300 yards passing, and just had his 2nd game of the season with multiple touchdown passes. Now, he didn't have to throw as much in week 8, but he has had 50-plus pass attempts now in 2 of his last 3 games played. He's really doing all this too, while barely missing the connection with Chris Olave. But now he gets a matchup going up against Chicago, and they allow 19.6 fantasy points per game, 3rd most in the league to opposing quarterbacks. Carr is for sure an option for me here this week. He has only connected with Chris Olave on 56% of his targets over the last 3 games played. If we could get that somewhere near 75%, we're not only going to be very happy with the production of Chris Olave, but we will be of Derek Carr as well. Which will then take us out to Carolina for the Panthers and the Colts. We'll start off with Gardner Minshew. And if Gardner Minshew could limit the dang turnovers, he may just be a weekly locked and loaded quarterback in fantasy football, but he has 9 turnovers over the last 3 games played. I mean, we're talking about a guy that could easily go out and score 18 plus points a week if he could just learn how to limit the damn turnovers. Because despite having some difficult matchups here as of late, going up against the likes of the Cleveland Browns and New Orleans Saints, he has 6 touchdowns in those last 2 games combined. He's obviously got a connection with Michael Pittman and Josh Downs as well, and they've already proven to be enough for him to have a fairly safe floor. Now they're going up against Carolina, another not so easy matchup. Carolina allows 15 fantasy points per game, 9th fewest in the league. Minshew will for sure continue to air it out though. But we cannot ignore the fact that the Carolina Panthers are a lot easier to run on than they are to throw on, so don't be surprised if we see a lot of Jonathan Taylor and a lot of Zach Moss this week as well. Minshew's going to remain one of those boom or bust weekly plays, but he will be somebody who's verged top 12 in my rankings here this week. As for his opponent in Bryce Young, Bryce is getting better-ish, right? His vision in the pocket when it comes to avoiding pass rush, though, is just seriously lacking. It's hard enough for him to see over his offensive linemen and then go through his progressions and then maneuver away from pass rushers. It's just a struggle right now for Bryce Young. He has been sacked over 4 times now in 4 of his last 5 games played. The kid has taken an absolute beating. He still only has 1 game on the year with multiple touchdowns. He doesn't really run very much for any type of rushing upside. He just has a very limited ceiling week in and week out. But now a matchup going up against Indianapolis isn't all that bad. They allow 17 fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks, but Bryce has only scored over 14 fantasy points 1 time in a game all year. Now, really the best way that I can describe Bryce Young in a fantasy football sense is I'm trying to win fantasy football matchups. I'm not going out each week and trying to not lose, if that makes sense. Bryce may have a decent floor, but his ceiling isn't matchup winning, and more times than not, he's not going to lead you to fantasy football victories. Now, speaking of not leading you to fantasy football victories, what about the next matchup? The New York Giants and Las Vegas Raiders. Daniel Jones and Jimmy G. This one is disgusting, right? We'll start off with Daniel Jones because it sounds like he has a chance to be back here in week 9. This is my happy face. I'm just not looking forward. I'm not pumped about it either. I'm right there with you. This New York offense is boring AF to watch week in and week out. They are the lowest scoring team in the NFL, and they have a whole bunch of mid-wide receivers. Now, even when Daniel Jones was healthy, he'd only had 1 game all year over 10 fantasy points. So we're not putting the bar very high for Daniel Jones, right? Not a bad matchup going up against Las Vegas, but this offensive line continues to be beyond injured. And now Darren Waller is also questionable with a hamstring injury. Maybe Daniel Jones can offer some second half of the season upside, but in his first game back, having to worry about Max Crosby and that pass rush is enough to put the risk through the roof and really not make me be overly interested if Daniel Jones is named the starter this week. As for Jimmy G, I don't know if I have seen a more pathetic attempt at offense than what we just saw from Las Vegas in week 8. Devontae Adams and Jacoby Myers combined for 2 catches for 30 yards. No wide receiver or tight end for that matter had over 19 yards receiving in that ball game. He couldn't stay upright. He got sacked 6 times. There was just no quick routes. It was just a typical Josh McDaniels crap fest out there on the field, and you can definitely start to see all the frustrations on the faces of all the players there in that organization. Now they get a matchup going up against the Giants. They allow 15.1 fantasy points per game, 10th fewest in the league. As for injuries right now, it really just looks like a lot of people have a busted give a damn meter, right? Because it doesn't seem to be going too well here in Las Vegas, and really, until Josh McDaniels is gone, I don't know if it's going to get any better after what we just saw there in week 8. I think we can all agree that we're just not going to trust Jimmy G in our fantasy lineups anytime soon. But what do you say we end the show on a bang, right? We got a couple high-end quarterbacks here playing later in the day on Sunday. The first matchup, Dallas Cowboys, Philadelphia Eagles, with Dak Prescott and Jalen Hurts. For Dak, he has strolled into LA now in back-to-back weeks and played pretty freaking good. Just had his best game of the season last week, 304 yards passing, 4 touchdowns, 1 interception, his first 300-yard game of the season, and his first game with multiple touchdowns thrown in over a month. It took 6 weeks for them to remember that CeeDee Lamb was pretty good and wide open all over the field. I'm glad they just finally figured it out because Dak Prescott is definitely benefiting from it. He's had 24-plus fantasy points now in back-to-back games and is getting dangerously close to being a top 12 quarterback in fantasy football. Now a matchup going up against Philadelphia. They allow 19.4 fantasy points per game, 3rd most in the league. The last 3 games that Dak has faced the Philadelphia Eagles, he's had at least 3 touchdowns in each one of those games. Now, obviously, the offensive line's still a little bit banged up. We've kind of seen that, though, with the running game, right? They just can't really seem to get it going with Tony Pollard. Now, I have gotten in the habit of starting quarterbacks against the Philadelphia defense almost weekly. It's worked out more times than not, so why stop now? I'm starting Dak Prescott here this week, and we already know we start Jalen Hurts, of course. He's the quarterback 2 overall in fantasy football. He's had over 20 fantasy points in every game this season, with the exception of week 1. He's had multiple touchdowns in every game this season, with the exception of week 1. He's been doing it as of late without running the ball as well. Only 27 total yards rushing over the last 2 games combined. A.J. Brown is giving Jalen Hurts a ridiculously high ceiling almost all by himself. Now a matchup going up against Dallas. They allow 14.3 fantasy points per game. That's 5th fewest in the league, but there's no new injuries here in Philadelphia to worry about, and even though this matchup isn't some cream puff, no way in HE double hockey sticks do we ever sit Jalen Hurts in fantasy football. All right, next matchup, Sunday Night Football, a match of the Buffalo Bills and Cincinnati Bengals, my Manscaped matchup of the week. Now, I don't know about you, but it is absolutely crazy that it's already almost November. This year has absolutely flown by, and the holidays are right around the corner. Maybe you can buy yourself something for your stocking. Maybe you want to get something funny for a buddy. Maybe you want to make your dad's face turn red on Christmas morning. Whichever one of those you so choose, there is definitely something over at manscaped.com to get you taken care of. It's not just body hair trimmers. They have body wash, they have deodorant, lip balm, boxer briefs, whatever it is you're looking for, they have you covered. But the last thing you want to do is head over there, find something you like, and not get a discount on it. So be sure to use the referral code HEADLINERS at checkout for 20% off and free shipping. But we'll go ahead and start it off here with Josh Allen because we already know we're going to start Josh Allen this week, the current quarterback 1 overall in fantasy football, and a rematch of what most people kind of want to forget from last year. Now, Josh Allen is averaging 24.2 fantasy points per game and has 22 total touchdowns on the season. That's the most of any quarterback in the NFL. In a matchup going up against Cincinnati, they allow over 16.5 fantasy points per game. There's still a defense that has multiple injuries, really forcing Josh Allen to have to keep his foot on the pedal and throwing for all 4 quarters. Now, they did just sign Leonard Fournette. I really don't see him doing much this week, but you got to expect that with the way that this defense is playing in Buffalo, Josh is going to have to continue to air it out and make him a super high-end fantasy option weekly for his opponent, Joe Burrow. I am so glad to finally see Joe Burrow back and healthy. 8 touchdowns over his last 3 games played. He'd only had 2 touchdowns in his previous 4 games before that. The Bengals have now won 3 straight games in a row, and they've beat a couple of good teams. They're finally starting to turn it around, which overall is great for fantasy because of all the fantasy assets that are on this team. We just saw Jamar Chase go out with a 100-yard game. T. Higgins second on the team in targets. Joe Mixon had his best game of the year. A healthy Joe Burrow makes all of that happen. Now a matchup going up against Buffalo. They allow 13.2 fantasy points per game, but with all of their injuries, they're just not as shut down as they were to start the year. This team is finally starting to get healthy, like I mentioned in Cincinnati. 2 of the best quarterbacks in the NFL. In primetime football, you better believe we're hoping for a whole lot of touchdowns, and we're starting both of these guys. How about Monday Night Football? We have a matchup between the Los Angeles Chargers and New York Jets. We know we're starting Justin Herbert, and you also know we're probably not starting Zach Wilson. For Herbert, just imagine what he could be doing in fantasy football if he didn't have the most ridiculously wrapped broken finger you've ever seen each and every week. He's gone out there and scored 19 plus fantasy points in all but 1 game this season. He's finally starting to get a little bit more comfortable with first-round pick wide receiver Quentin Johnston as well. Plus, with the return of Austin Eckler, we're starting to see this floor creep up week in and week out for Justin Herbert, making him safer and safer. We love ourselves some of those Austin Eckler checkdowns that turn into big fantasy plays. But now it's a matchup going up against the Jets. They allow 16.1 fantasy points per contest, and we all know this isn't going to be some easy matchup for Justin Herbert, especially since we know that he's probably still going to be without tight end Gerald Everett, and that we know wide receiver Josh Palmer is dealing with a knee injury. He continues to try to gut it out, but you can definitely tell it's affecting him on the field. Now, normally, I would be a little bit worried about Sauce Gardner in this matchup, but Keenan plays in the slot, so that doesn't concern me very much. And we know that Austin Eckler can make those big plays happen out of the backfield. The Jets also struggle to control opposing tight ends as well. I still think we have a solid shot at a decent game this week for Justin Herbert, and we can't afford to sit him anyway. As for Zach Wilson, listen, I was excited for Tyson Bagent against this defense last week. I have to be excited for Zach Wilson, right? I'm not really. Zach Wilson had a great matchup just a couple weeks ago against Philadelphia, a game in which the Jets won, and Zach Wilson only had 10 fantasy points. He's had only 1 total touchdown over the last 3 weeks of the season, has only thrown over 240 yards 1 time all season. But this matchup against the Chargers, they allow 22.8 fantasy points per game, the most overall in the NFL. This offensive line in New York, they can't get any more injured than they currently are. They just added Wes Schweitzer, which is a super difficult name to say if you haven't had to say it before. Connor McGovern, they've both been added to the IR here as of late, so this offensive line is just getting worse. This would have to be one of those I have no better options type scenarios. Could I see Zach Wilson go out there and score 18 points? Sure. But I could also see him go out there and score like 10 fantasy points and create a fantasy loss for my team, so it is very hard to trust him each and every week. All right, that's going to do it for our quarterback start and sit here for week 9 fantasy football. Hopefully I was able to give you a little bit of information to really get this week kick-started. Don't forget though, if you're looking at a couple possible options, our rankings will be out Thursday morning to help you make those final decisions. I know this week is not going to be an easy one for the quarterback position, but let's do our best to have a great week. Enjoy some football here. Once again, we're at the halfway mark of the season. All that time we spent looking forward to it, and here it is, half over, which is absolutely, I literally cannot believe that it's almost November. But I'm going to go ahead and get out of here for the day. Hopefully you guys enjoy the rest of your day here as well. And then most importantly, do your part to make the world a better place.